In this section, we're going to take a look at the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is a clear fluid that circulates through cavities in the brain known as ventricles, through the central canal, an opening that travels through the center of the spinal cord, and also in the subarachnoid space that is around the spinal cord and around the brain. You'll notice that the cerebrospinal fluid circulates. In other words, it's not static. It's constantly being made and constantly being reabsorbed. And later we'll look at where it's made and where it's reabsorbed. You make approximately 480 milliliters each day of the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid has a variety of functions. One of them is a mechanical protection. It absorbs shock and therefore protects the brain and the spinal cord. It also provides chemical protection. The ionic composition of the cerebrospinal fluid within the brain helps to keep the neurons working properly. And thirdly, the cerebrospinal fluid helps transport nutrients and waste from the blood and the nervous tissue. Let's now look at a variety of anatomical structures that relate to the cerebrospinal fluid, and then we'll look at the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. The ventricles are cerebrospinal fluid-filled cavities within the brain. There are two lateral ventricles, one in each of the cerebral hemispheres. The third ventricle is found in the area of the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle is found in the brainstem and cerebellum area. And we'll take a look at a picture of these in just a second. In this picture, we can see the location of the four ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles, and cerebrospinal fluid is made within them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That fluid travels through a space called the interventricular foramen and goes into the third ventricle. Cerebrospinal fluid is also produced in the third ventricle. The cerebrospinal fluid then travels through an opening called the aqueduct of the midbrain, or cerebral aqueduct, and goes down into the fourth ventricle. Again, cerebrospinal fluid is likewise made there. From there, the fluid exits the fourth ventricle and goes through two openings, two lateral apertures, and through a median aperture. From there, the cerebrospinal fluid goes down into the central canal. Let's now look at how the cerebrospinal fluid is formed and where it circulates. There are special structures called Colloid Plexuses that are networks of capillaries found within the walls of the ventricles. These specialized capillaries produce the cerebrospinal fluid. These capillaries that are part of the Colloid Plexuses are covered by a certain kind of neuroglial cell referred to as impendable cells. And we'll take a look at a picture of this in just a second. Plasma is drawn from the Colloid Plexuses through impendable cells into the ventricles to produce cerebrospinal fluid. So in just a second, we're going to take a look at a picture and we'll explain this in more detail. Here in this portion of the picture, we can see a section through a choroid plexus. As this picture indicates, the fluid portion of the blood, called plasma, squeezes out through the capillary, goes through the impendable cells that line these capillaries, and then becomes cerebrospinal fluid. The impendable cells prevent certain substances from leaving the plasma and becoming part of the cerebrospinal fluid. So in this way, this protects the brain and the spinal cord from potentially harmful substances. In this diagram, we can also see the two lateral ventricles of the brain, and we can see a choroid plexus here within this lateral ventricle. Let's now take a look at a picture that illustrates where cerebrospinal fluid is produced and where it circulates. As we can see here, we have a choroid plexus in a lateral ventricle, and it is generating cerebrospinal fluid within the lateral ventricle. That cerebrospinal fluid then goes through an opening called the interventricular foramen that connects the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. Within the third ventricle, we also have cerebrospinal fluid being made. The fluid that's within the third ventricle then travels through the aqueduct of the midbrain, or the cerebral aqueduct, and goes down into the fourth ventricle. There, more cerebrospinal fluid is made by the choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. The fluid from there then travels through two lateral ventricles and through a median aperture, and the fluid from there then goes into the central canal of the spinal cord and also goes into the subarachnoid space that surrounds both the brain and the spinal cord. As we can see from this diagram, the cerebrospinal fluid of the subarachnoid space is found here, and then it enters these structures, one shown here, called an arachnoid villus. This arachnoid villus is a projection of the arachnoid mater into a blood vessel that's called the superior sagittal sinus. This is a venous system, and so the cerebrospinal fluid squeezes out of the arachnoid villus and goes into a vein. The veins, of course, then eventually carry the blood back toward the heart, and then it becomes part of the arterial system. Let's now take a look at a picture that diagrams the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. As we can see here, the cerebrospinal fluid is made in the lateral ventricles, goes through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. The third ventricle's choroid plexus also produces cerebrospinal fluid, which goes into the third ventricle. The fluid in the third ventricle then travels through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. Additional cerebrospinal fluid is made by the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. The fluid then travels through the lateral and median apertures into the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space forms certain structures called arachnoid villi that project into what's called the dural venous sinuses. The cerebrospinal fluid then becomes part of the venous blood and then travels through the heart and lungs and becomes arterial blood, and then goes back into the capillaries within each of the choroid plexuses. So as we can see here, the cerebrospinal fluid is not a static fluid, but rather is something that is constantly being made and constantly being reabsorbed.